Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. We have an official friend of the pod on the show today. And now that I think of it, maybe he's the first guest to be accorded that exalted yet somehow dubious status and gifted the accompanying t-shirt. He's not wearing it today, though. John Stackhouse is here making his fourth appearance on the Herle Burly. John's episodes always pull some of our highest audience numbers, and for good reason. He's a best-selling author, one of Canada's leading voices on innovation and economic disruption, a former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail and editor of the Report on Business, a senior fellow at the Howe Institute and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Today, John is a senior vice president, Office of the CEO at the Royal Bank of Canada, leading the bank's research and thought leadership on economic, technological, and social change. In December, he attended COP28, the Conference of the Parties, UN Climate Conference in Dubai, and he and his team at the bank have just published a new report on the state of Canada's climate progress, Climate Action 2024, Double or Trouble. There are very cool things happening in clean energy here and around the world, but as the title suggests, too little and too slowly. We'll break all that down in the next hour. John, welcome back to the Herle Burly. It's really great to have you here.
David, thanks for having me on the show. Really looking forward to this.
Yeah, how you doing?
I'm good. Other than bemoaning the disappearance of winter here in Toronto, although I think you might view winter as never being in Toronto, being a Saskatchewan guy.
No, it's right. But yeah, no, this is an unusually warm season, and for those of us who no longer lace on skates, that's just fine. But anyway,
and speaking of skates, it's the time of year when we still believe the Leafs have a chance.
Oh, I don't. I don't. They got four guys that are entertaining to watch, but they don't have a hockey team. All right, so let's get into it. I'm struck, first of all, I feel I need to take a step back and ask you, what is the Royal Bank of Canada's interest in climate change?
Yeah, it's a great question, David, and I'll answer with a couple of points. It is the single biggest challenge in our world and to our country, but also to our economy. If we do not transition to a lower emissions and ideally a net zero economy in our lifetime, hopefully by 2050, we're going to have significant economic challenges. So we have a self-interest at RBC in this, but it's also critical to our clients, whether they be oil and gas companies or farmers. They are all engaged. I get to travel the country and talk to a lot of those operators, and most of them, the majority of them, are either deeply invested or trying to invest in transition strategies, be it a farm or an oil and gas company or everything in between. And that's in their interest, and therefore it's in our interest to be on that journey with us. So as a country, we've got to figure this out for the sake of future generations, for the sake of the planet, for this generation. But it's also a big economic opportunity if we get it right. There are trillions of dollars, but in this country, literally tens of billions of dollars waiting to be invested in the opportunities that I hope we'll talk about in this conversation.
Is the bank kind of concerned about climate change in a way, or does the bank accept the IPCC science and the COP targets?
No, we've developed a fairly sophisticated strategy towards net zero that is 1.5 aligned, to use the terminology. This is hard stuff, and we're having active conversations with a big range of clients about how they are transitioning and taking a long view. This is not something that can be done in a year or, frankly, even in 5 years. But we do have to move steadily, kind of year by year. We have to measure how we're doing and be open to being measured in terms of how we're doing.
Right. So before we get into climate policy writ large, I have just one last question about the bank, because I'm kind of curious. Does this knowledge and belief system inform its business? Does it inform its lending decisions?
It helps us see the economy and where it's going. In fact, I got to talk with the CEO of a European bank who had a really good perspective on this. He said in his 30 or 40 years of banking, he has never seen a better opportunity as a banker to understand his clients than talking about transition strategies. Because when you talk to a client, it can be an industrial company, a cement maker, it can be a builder or a construction firm, and ask them what's their strategy for the 2030s and 2040s in terms of climate. What you're really asking is, what's their business strategy? Where are you taking your business in the next decade or two? And the clearer that is, the better the banking opportunity is going to be. And it allows you maybe not to shift up your clients completely, but you'll want to have a deeper relationship with those who have a more sophisticated long-term strategy.
So somebody that doesn't have a transition strategy doesn't really have a business strategy?
That's a great conversation. If they don't have a transition strategy, it does raise the question, where's your business going to be in, let's say, 2035, which is not a long ways off. Right? That's just a decade out. And if you're not investing for that today, it can be an electricity company or a transportation company, then that's going to raise questions, because society is going that way. The world is going that way. So as a company, if you're not going that way, help us understand your thinking a bit more.
Right. Okay, let's zoom into this report, which I loved. It's very readable, and it gives you some reason for hope, and it gives you a lot of reason to double down, which is actually the title of the report. Can you... what's the purpose of issuing a report like this? What does RBC want to happen with this report?
So we set up something a year ago called the RBC Climate Action Institute, which I get to oversee. It's part of our economics and thought leadership group. So it's rooted in economic analysis. And we felt it was important to have, we call it an institute, but a quasi-independent body within the bank that monitors and studies what's going on in the Great Transition, the way we do with the economy and all banks do with the economy. We think it's important to bring that kind of rigor to analyzing the climate transition and the energy transition. So as part of that, we thought maybe an annual report, a scorecard for Canada might be helpful. So this is our first one, and this is now the foundation that will allow us to come back a year from now and years hence and say, hey, Canada, this is how we're doing. Some of that's sort of analytical measures of sectors like the electricity sector, and there's some good analysis in there of consumers, because we want to provide a window, not a window, a mirror for Canadians to see how we're all doing.
So as I read it, and you may disagree, but as I read it, the fundamental point is of the report, the fundamental takeaway is, boy, we have a lot of work to do if we're going to meet these targets.
Yeah.
But you throughout the report's replete with examples of innovation and cool success stories and breakthroughs that people are making. Why did you want to emphasize those?
Well, it's a measure of how we're doing. And we are making progress. It's easy to throw your hands up and say, hey, nothing's working. Let's just figure on adaptation, kind of batten down the hatches. Well, that's an incorrect view. A lot is working. We're making progress. A couple of the measures that show that, first is capital flows, which have increased 50% in 3 years. That's pretty remarkable. Now, they still have to increase 2.5 times from where they are today very, very quickly. So we got a long ways to go, but we're not idling. We're not going in reverse. Also, it's fascinating to see what's going on, back to the point about consumer behavior, what's going on with heat pumps, which has become a bit of a thing in the last year. But last year, heat pump sales overtook gas furnace sales for the first time in this country. That's a really important crossover. So things are happening, and then we
do they work when it's cold or not? Like, this is the first question everybody says. Do they work when it's when you actually need them? Do they work?
Yeah, they work at minus 15, and so that raises a big question about what about minus 40? Because no one wants even to go one night at minus 40 if it's if your heat supply isn't going to keep you comfortable, let alone probably safe, let alone comfortable. But the technology is improving year on year, and there are many parts of the country where that's not an issue. So heat pump sales in Atlantic Canada, for instance, are really impressive, and I mean people there know the limits of them, and they're comfortable, quite literally, with that shift.
Yeah, probably a tough sell in the prairies, though.
Yeah, but we're a big, diverse country, and there's going to be different technologies emerging in different phases and different stages. And I hope we can get deeper into that, because the one size fits all approach to climate policy is something that I think is already shifting in the country, and that's going to be important for policy, whether it's electricity regulations, but also for consumers, to know that our choice in vehicles, for instance, is going to be different. It is different today, and it's going to be different many years from now in big centers like Vancouver than it would be in Saskatchewan, and that's fine. We can have different options for different parts of our geography.
But it's interesting you say a one-size-fits-all thing is on its way out. But the impression I got from the report, and please just correct me if I've misunderstood the report at any point, but the impression I got from the report is by far the biggest actor in driving dollars into climate has been the federal government. You point out some provincial governments, in notably Alberta, have been making a contribution as well, but it felt to me like between the private sector, provincial governments, or federal government, that the federal government was the main driver of action. Yeah,
80% of climate spending since the Paris Agreement has come from the federal government. That can't continue. And that's one of the points we really want to stress with the report. That's been really important to heat pump adoption, to EV adoption, to industrial transitions that are going on in the petrochemical sector, in the oil and gas sector. That federal money is all, I shouldn't say it's all, but it's significantly shifting parts of the economy, but that can't be sustained. The provinces do have to step up. I'm glad you mentioned Alberta, because Alberta is often sort of portrayed as a holdout in this. Alberta's actually a leader in a lot, and has been for many years, in a lot of what's going on in the climate transition, and will continue to be. But Alberta also has to do more. All provinces have to do more, but it's really the private sector where those billions of dollars of investable capital that needs to find a profit, a return for shareholders or for investors, that's where the opportunity is for the rest of the decade.
So you're saying, just to be for instance, that the British Columbia government, which is vociferously in favor of climate action publicly, is doing less on its own than the Alberta government, which is vociferously anti-climate action in its rhetoric, doing. Is that correct?
I'm not sure the Alberta government is anti-climate. They just, and Daniel Smith, who's out in Ontario this week, has a different framework.
Well, they wouldn't want to be seen as a climate leader. Nothing about their rhetoric indicates to me that they want to be understood as a climate leader.
I think they want to be a carbon neutral leader, is how they would put it. And it's a different economy. It's a resource heavy and also a heavy industry based economy. Thus, it's got more emissions, and certainly more emissions per capita than most jurisdictions. So its challenge is going to be different than for an economy like British Columbia or Nova Scotia.
Right. So let's talk about some of the successes. It really does sound like a lot of money's going into wind, and that wind is becoming very, very efficient. Is that correct?
Yeah, wind is taking off, and Canada's got a lot of wind. We've got two wonderful coastlines for that, but also that vast stretch of prairie is also great for wind. Now, there's also lots of challenges with wind.
Anybody who's ever been to Lethbridge, come on, people, Jesus.
I have been to Lethbridge and marvel at that scenery of wind farms along the way. But you see this in southwestern Ontario and in lots of other parts of the country. And wind for a lot of Canada's geography is more favorable than solar. We have lots of opportunity in solar, but wind is very suitable for Canada, with some needs, specifically storage, which is going to be a big area of focus, I suspect, for the country in the next half decade. We've got to bring down the cost of storage, but also invest more in storage, because the wind doesn't blow all the time, as Albertans know all too well. But there's technology solutions for that.
So what is the prospect of storage, John? Because, I mean, one of the arguments in favor of, say, for instance, expanding nuclear is the need in a renewables-based electricity system to have baseline power that's there 24/7. Right? Do you think we can get to a point where we don't need that?
We're going to need a lot of everything, and certainly a lot of the energy sources that we're talking about. So wind and solar and gas to a degree are going to be needed across the country for a number of years. Now, Canada is in the blessed position of having all those assets. So how do we create the right portfolios? And there's going to be different in different parts of the country that ensure that there's stable electricity supplies, affordable electricity supplies, and increasingly sustainable, i.e. lower and lower emission electricity supplies.
Are you optimistic about the small modular reactor technology?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of hype around that, but indications are very positive. And Canada is the leader in SMRs, and this is a huge global opportunity. And we as Canadians don't think, all too often, we don't think ambitiously enough.
And Canada owns Westinghouse now, or Canadians own Westinghouse now.
Exactly. And what's going on in Ontario? The governor of Indiana was here a couple of years ago. The leader of Poland was here last year, scouting out what we're doing. So Ontario can be a global leader in the space, and things are shaping up fairly positively for that to be the case. Now, Ontario will be rolling out SMRs, 2027, 28, I believe. There's big opportunities for Saskatchewan, for other parts of the country, also to export that into the U.S. Point being, this is essential for Canada's climate transition. But what a big global economic opportunity this is for us to be the exporter of this new generation of nuclear technology, just like we were with CANDUs back in the 50s and 60s. A lot of brain power is going to be needed, so big challenge to universities and community colleges, but great jobs there, and as I said, great export opportunities.
Right. What's that hoary cliche car salespeople always say in the movies just before the real haggling starts? Some variation of, so, Dave, what's it going to take to put you behind the wheel of this beautiful car? Well, when it comes to autonomous, self-driving vehicles, the answer to that is a whole hell of a lot of connectivity. AVs are coming, Herle Burly-ites. Remember the nomenclature I introduced last week? They're nearly now. So on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, let's pop the metaphorical hood on the subject. As uptake and capacity for AVs increase, think of the data streams these cars both produce and require. Basically, it's like the biggest multi-lane highway you can imagine, with traffic traveling in multiple directions, AVs communicating with not just other AVs, but every single vehicle on the road. Also, traffic lights, crosswalks, charging stations, rail crossings, wayfinding programs, and just about everything else floating up there in the cloud. Managing those volumes of data requires exactly what you think: robust, reliable, and expansive networks. Not to mention coast-to-coast coverage. Without it, AVs would be unusable. TELUS continues to be a prime driver in the space, making the necessary billion-dollar investments, pairing their world-class network with the latest driving technology. Consumers benefit with improved safety and reliability, and our economy benefits too, by signaling to business they're a leader in the industry, which spurs even more investment and opportunity. Sort of a virtuous circle in that, eh? But like I've been saying, none of it happens without regulatory conditions that continue to make it all make fiscal sense. Next week, we'll dig deep for another nearly now story: autonomous mining. So wind is going to be the primary renewable in Canada, do you think, more than solar?
Yeah, we think so.
Yeah. And Are we getting past all the NIMBYism about that? People getting more comfortable with wind farms?
No, no. This is among the challenges that we need to think through. And look, I don't have a wind farm in my backyard, so it's easy for me to say we need to get over it. And if someone came and planted one in my backyard, I probably wouldn't be happy with that. So how do we balance community needs and aspirations with broader societal needs? And this isn't just a Canadian thing. I was interested to hear John Kerry speak about this a few weeks ago, where he said this is maybe the biggest challenge to the U.S. goals for the Biden administration of 2030 is NIMBYism and the very active court system in the U.S. The number of cases is increasing significantly to block wind farms, but also other renewable projects. So that's a challenge, David, and not a new one. This has been with us probably as long as there have been wind farms, but it's also, especially with new technologies like storage, becomes more manageable because you can situate wind farms perhaps in slightly different places if you have the storage and can manage the transmission challenges.
So when Ontario was starting to move into the renewable energy sphere in the late 90s, early in the 2000s. Sorry, not the late 90s, in the 2000s. It was seen, things like wind were seen as forces that were driving up the cost of electricity in Ontario because wind was more expensive than the coal it was replacing. But wind is cheap now, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, and this is a classic economic supply curve where in the early days of anything new costs more. We know that from our phones and from lots of other things. And
VCRs, man. VCRs.
I can't even remember what VCR stands for, actually. You have the cost curve, it goes up and then it comes down as you scale. And we're seeing that with wind, which is why typically you need to subsidize the early part of the adoption curve. And that includes subsidizing those early adopters who use it. It could be wind turbines, heat pumps, EVs. We're seeing that pattern across, and this isn't just a Canadian thing. You're seeing this this globally with the price of electric vehicles, for instance, coming significantly down as the numbers grow.
Right. Okay. One of the things I thought was interesting in the report was that you put a lot of time and effort on carbon capture, and you said there's a lot of money in Canada going into carbon capture. I think a very high percentage of Canadian federal government subsidies have gone to carbon capture and storage. This is a real technology. This will really work.
The indications are it is. I mean, well, let me say more than indications. It is already working in many parts of the world, but Canada has demonstrated how carbon capture can work. The challenge now is to make it work at a scale that we haven't seen. That's what the Pathways Alliance is setting out to do. But there's no proof that it doesn't work, and a lot of indications that it will work at this scale that, frankly, we need if we're going to hit our targets. Oil and gas production, and I think every forecast I've seen shows it's going to increase in Canada out to 2030. The federal emissions cap is predicated on an increase of oil and gas production out to 2030. We are all complicit in that, depending on your point of view. Complicit meaning we're all participating in that growth because all of us, directly or indirectly, use oil and gas every day. So as long as we're doing that, how do we continue to invest in the technologies, carbon capture specifically, that allow us to continue to produce oil and gas that helps our economy run the way it runs while capturing emissions that gives us a bit of time to advance these other technologies, including renewables?
So if I had if I had a climate activist on here, if Elizabeth May was on here, she would argue with us about carbon capture and storage, and she would probably argue that it doesn't work, and secondly, she would. My guess is that she thinks we should be shutting down oil and gas anyway. So which of those arguments is really? I mean, is this something that we should be betting as heavily on as we are?
Yeah, and she and I've had good debates about that. I've known Elizabeth for many years, and really admire her commitment to these issues and to Canada. And there's no absolute right here. We're trying different things, and we need to continue to try different things and see what works most effectively, and then scale that very quickly. But you laid out two really fundamental challenges to all Canadians to come to grips with. One is the one you mentioned second, which is the use of oil and gas and whether to shut it down. There's no government elected that I know of, certainly in North America, that is even considering that. The Trudeau government is very clear that we need oil and gas, and we'll continue to need a lot of oil and gas well into the 2030s. What we need to focus on is emissions. Now, that's not a blank card to just continue to expand oil and gas production and exports, but it is a realistic view that we're going to need oil and gas for many years. Our economy depends on it. The hospitals and schools and transit systems, even those that are electrifying, require a degree of oil and gas. And we're lucky in this country to have that supply. A lot of countries, in fact, most countries in the world don't have that secure supply. We're also sitting next door to the economic superpower that is now the world's largest oil and gas producer. I mean, this is, if there's nothing else Canadian or listeners remember from this, it's at this point that our next door neighbor that we all know and I think love
under Biden,
under Obama, starting with Obama, has become the world's dominant oil and gas producer, and is quite blunt. That is going to continue because energy security is national security. And we're part of a North American economy. We supply the U.S. Most of our oil sands production goes to the U.S. And we benefit from that with all the U.S. dollars, all the U.S. dollars we get. Now, point to stress here is that we have an opportunity to leverage that economic resource to invest in the reduction of emissions. So how can we be more deliberate about harnessing these resources through royalties and taxes to invest first in carbon capture to reduce the emissions, and as we scale that, to secondly invest in renewable and low carbon technologies like nuclear through the 2030s and 40s. This stuff is going to take decades. You asked about SMRs. I mean, SMRs, we think, are a really good opportunity and will take years, but frankly, decades to have an impact at scale in a way that oil and gas does today. So we call it a transition because it's not a switch. It's not a switch, it's a dial. And we have to keep turning the dial and know that it's going to take a couple of decades to get the dial to where we want it to be.
So the way I had normally understand carbon capture was that you'd have a steel plant or a cement plant, and that steel or cement plant would have a carbon capture technology attached to it that would capture the carbon that was being produced by that facility and store it somewhere. But in the report, you hint at a different idea. You hint at mass carbon capture from the atmosphere. Somebody a couple of years ago whose opinion I respect told me that this is the actual answer, that we are not going to reduce emissions globally in time, and that this whole program rests on ultimately being able to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Is that true?
That's a really interesting technology that has a lot of potential, but we can't bet on one technology. We're going to have to try SMRs, carbon capture, direct air capture, plus renewables, which we know work and are starting to work at scale. We have to continue to invest in all of these and rely probably on all of these for a couple of decades, and then continue to invest more in those that are working as they scale.
This sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, though, sounds like a get-out-of-jail-free card, though. It does sound like the magic bullet if you could do it, right?
Well, that, and I love the latest idea of having essentially an umbrella out in space that blocks the sun's rays enough that the Earth's temperature would come down a degree. I mean, this is kind of Dr. Strangelove territory, or Austin Powers, depending on the generation listening.
Snowpiercer. Have you seen Snowpiercer?
Now we're talking. So, these are fanciful. I'm not saying direct air capture is fanciful. That's actually working in a lot of places. But sometimes these frontier technologies work. We all have those in our lives in all sorts of ways. And we have to continue to test and learn.
Think what it means to lead a company in 2024. There was a time, not terribly long ago, when shareholders and big investors really only had one expectation: that the company would, within the bounds of the law, make as much money as possible. Governments and regulators were pretty much on board with that. There was a deep pool of skilled and unskilled labor available. Nobody but economists had even heard of supply chains. All of that has, it's changed. Like all big companies, our sponsor, CN, now competes with its peers to recruit in a tight labor market. Employees nowadays come to the job with different expectations. Stakeholders and investors are increasingly active. There is pressure to create sustainability and a workforce that reflects the diversity of the population. And of course, to continue earning profits in a volatile economy with sclerotic global supply chains. That's what it means to lead a company these days. CN's approach is discipline and a relentless focus on service. Producers, manufacturers, and shippers must have reliability. That means the trains have to depart and arrive on time more often and spend less time sitting in the station, which is exactly what's been happening at CN the past couple of years. Freight trains are already among the cheapest, most efficient means of moving essential goods. CN believes adding rock-solid reliability to the equation is the way to grow. At the same time, the railway strives to deepen the trust of its employees, its neighbors, the indigenous communities along its network, and governments at all levels. A lot has been written about the supposed tension between profitability and good corporate citizenry. CN believes that in 2024, those remits are complementary. Neither can exist on its own. CN had a good year in 2023. It intends on having a better one in 2024. It intends to grow. So, the theme of the book is that, as I said earlier, too little, too slowly. It's not fatalistic, but it's too little, too slowly. Is that true of Canada? Where are we relative to other countries in terms of our climate action?
We're in line with most like-sized, like-minded economies. Often we compare, we pull out the Nordics and say, look what they're doing. But we're making significant progress up against the United States, which is the most comparable economy, up against Australia, up against the large European economies, Britain, France, Germany, which have ups and downs, steps forward and back, and also appreciating that. There are other economies like ours. In some ways, there's no country or economy like Canada, where we are a producer and exporter of all major resources, including all major sources of energy. We're a small population, 40 million. So per capita is always going to be higher when you're an exporter, an exporting nation with a small population. That's actually a good thing. Most countries are envious of that, but I'd say Canada's in line with most of the countries you'd want to be compared with.
So you were at COP. Does Canada speak with moral authority at a COP, or are we a bad actor?
It depends on who you ask. Who you ask. I don't come across many people who see Canada as a bad actor. I think our biggest challenge, frankly, and I saw this in spades at COP, is that we are not being ambitious enough as an economic player in the new economy. COP has become a business conference. And this really rattles a lot of environmentalists who say, like, who let the business people in? Well, look, if you want trillions of dollars, which we all know is going to be needed to finance the biggest economic transition, really a transformation that any of us have seen, you're going to have business people. You're going to have investors. You're going to have pension funds and venture capitalists involved. And those are kinds of people are showing up at these climate conferences in big ways. I was taken aback. Now, this is in Dubai, which is a kind of the commercial heart of the Middle East, really. So not necessarily representative of a lot of other centers of climate action. But I was taken aback at how many business people were engaged and leaning into the climate conversation, and how many countries were showing up saying, this is an economic advantage for us. We need to be mindful of what countries like Saudi Arabia are doing and what China is doing. China owns the EV market right now globally and has built supply chains that we need to develop. Saudi Arabia has ambitions to be the green hydrogen superpower, and to do with green hydrogen what it has done with oil, and is channeling billions and billions of dollars into this. Canada needs to, because we have what it takes, but we should be out there saying, hey, world, whether it's green hydrogen or carbon capture or direct air or EV charging networks or critical minerals, we are going to be a leader in the world in all these things that are essential to our collective transition to a net zero economy. And not only just for national reasons, but to export this to the world. Because a lot of countries are saying, look, we need the technologies that you're developing. We talked about SMRs
Wouldn't every
earlier.
country be saying that to itself, though, John? Like, what special advantages would Canada have in being a developer of climate technology?
So first on resources. So we are a leader in mining. We should be a leader in critical minerals, the way we have been for centuries in classical minerals. We are a leader in oil and gas and the sophisticated technologies of producing lower emissions oil and gas. How do we continue to develop that and then export that? Carbon capture, a technology we can scale, and I think will scale, but should be exporting that to every country that is looking at that. We talked about SMRs. That's a clear opportunity, in our view, for Canada to be the world leader if in this new generation of nuclear technology, as we were 50 years ago plus with CANDUs. And countries around the world are looking for this and still see Canada as a good actor, as a country that you would, if you're going to buy nuclear technology, especially civilian nuclear technology from someone, Canada's going to be at the top of the list. And there's a lot of not so good actors out there who are trying to sell this stuff to different parts of the world with much more than commercial opportunities on their mind. Everyone sees this and knows this. We need to be a bit more elbows up as Canadians, being out there saying, we have these technologies, we're really good at it, and we're trustworthy as a trading partner and as a supplier. Mm.
You brought up China, and I just want you to clarify for my listeners here where China is at on all this, because you can't get 5 minutes into a conversation about climate change before somebody brings up China and says, "Fuck, they're building coal plants every goddamn day. Why are we doing anything here?"
China's doing everything. China is building coal plants, but it's also building the technologies, developing the technologies to capture the emissions from those plants. It has, as I mentioned, built out EV supply chains that are second to none in the world. One of the interesting things that's going on, though, is with the trade tensions that will continue for well beyond the foreseeable future. China is at risk of oversupplying, particularly on EVs. It has ramped up production of EVs and is exporting those. You've probably seen the Europeans particularly the Germans, are saying enough of that. We're going to fight this because you're subsidizing and dumping all those EVs onto our market. So again, an opportunity for Canada as we develop a battery supply chain and the EV supply chain, and this dovetails with the Biden agenda, which I think will continue post Biden if there is a post Biden. That allows us to become the exporter, not just of electric vehicles, but of the components, batteries, and critical minerals among them that a lot of the world is going to be looking to, rather than being dependent on China.
Subsidizing these battery plants to come to Canada, is that a good policy?
We need to see the detailed math. It's big numbers. I think one of the realities that we need to appreciate is that without subsidies at that scale, we wouldn't have those plants. And without those plants, we wouldn't have a supply chain. And you can't turn a corner in southwestern Ontario, but also probably turn off the Quebec-Windsor corridor without seeing the automotive supply chain that the central Canadian economy is dependent on. That is shifting. And 10, 20 years from now is going to be predominantly an EV supply chain. We can be a leader in that. But we need to subsidize that, whatever the magnitude is, in these early days.
Mm. Okay, so you mentioned if there's a post-Biden era, and the report says that the required investments over the next decade are going to have to be led by government, by the public sector. Governments will need to invest more than they have been investing in climate action. In North America, at least, it looks like we're headed toward governments that are going to be less interested in climate action, not more interested in climate action. I don't want you to be political. I just want you to comment on what happens in the event that governments don't step up.
Well, I think the point of the report, David, is that governments need to continue to support the climate transition, but this needs to shift fairly rapidly to private investment. And there is the private capital. We're seeing this in spades in the United States. And there's Canadian capital, whether it's Brookfield or CPPIB or AIMCO, other pension funds and institutional sources across the country, looking for these opportunities and investing in the U.S. because there aren't enough economic opportunities in this country. That kind of competition is good, and whether there's a change, it's not just the White House. The Senate and Congress more largely is going to be even more critical than the presidency, I suspect. But we're going to have a tighter fiscal environment, both in Canada and the US in the years ahead. I think that's a fairly safe forecast. The pandemic years of deficit spending are winding down. And as that happens and we kind of return to a bit more fiscal normalcy, how do we ensure that there are the incentives, including regulatory frameworks, that allow that private capital to flow, and more important than the private capital, the entrepreneurs, the businesses, the operators to create these projects and businesses that the capital is looking for.
So you think that Trump leaves the Investment Reduction Act type of measures in place? I mean, one of the things that, yeah?
A lot of them, because they're heavily weighted to red states. And one of the shifts, and it'll be interesting if there's a change in government in this country, to see is the power and determination of subnational jurisdictions. So you have a lot of states, including ones like Texas, that are aiming to lead the climate transition. Texas has set out to be a green hydrogen superpower. It has the wind and the solar capabilities to create green hydrogen and export that to the world. And it's a great exporter of energy. as we all know. So any move by Washington to hold Texas back is going to meet severe resistance. It will be interesting in Canada if there's a change and a conservative government nationally. You have provinces now, including Ontario, that are leaning into this. We've talked about SMRs. We talked about battery storage, which Ontario is really picking up. The Ford
but is anybody going to miss the
on.
consumer? Is anybody going to miss the consumer carbon tax?
I don't think anyone's going to miss it and put a placard on their lawn or whatever saying bring back the carbon tax. But that kind of misses the point of the emphasis right now being on the industrial side of the economy. And an industrial carbon tax, whatever you want to call it, has worked in Alberta, which is where it started, but also we've seen works in other jurisdictions, including here in Ontario. And I mean, most people I talk to expect that to be kind of the direction of travel, regardless of who's in office in Ottawa through the back half of the 2020s. We will, whether there's a consumer carbon tax or not, we will have an industrial carbon pricing mechanism because industry needs that. This is an example. Dow Chemical has made a massive investment in Alberta. And one of the reasons it did that is because of carbon pricing, because it had the certainty in this country. And we see that from investors and from clients in all sorts of sectors. So all to say, I think the provinces and federal government, regardless of who's in power provincially or federally, are going to continue to try to develop industrial carbon pricing models because it makes economic sense. And that's actually where the emissions challenge is. So it additionally makes sense to focus on that rather than on the consumer side.
Yeah, I mean, the Biden approach seemed to me to recognize a fundamental fact of life that your report recognizes, which is that for better or worse, judge them for being myopic or self-interested or whatever, citizens are not prepared to make standard of living sacrifices to combat climate change right now. And so that's why a policy like the consumer carbon tax is very, very vulnerable, because as soon as it starts to matter, people say, well, I don't want to pay this thing. And that's what we're seeing. So Biden's approach was a no sacrifice policy, right? We're not going to ask you to pay anything. We're going to put out masses of money from the government, and we're not going to raise taxes to do it. We're just going to deficit finance it. So it's really just free. Our climate plan is free. And that's, I think, the only one that can work. But is it viable for the whole world to do that, or can only the United States do that?
Well, if the United States does it and leads, the rest of the world is going to
but fiscally, sorry, I was thinking
adhere to that.
I was thinking fiscally, right? Can everybody else just say, well, I don't give a shit how much it costs, we'll just do it?
I think we're going to see a lot of countries trying to free ride off the U.S., see it develop these technologies, and then literally buy the technologies or buy into them. But what Biden has done was a wake-up call to Europe, and it's not just about subsidies, David. It's also about regulation. I think what the IRA or IRA said to the world, it wasn't just that there's a lot of government money that can be put on the table. It's that there's an opportunity of speed. And I hear this from private sector operators, including here in Canada, say, I mean, yes, the money is important, but the speed of decision and action in the US is breathtaking. So, and the Europeans are saying the same. The Germans are saying this, that we have to make regulatory decisions and permitting decisions in weeks and months, not in years and decades, which has been the European way. I think that message needs to be understood
the European
more clearly
way.
by
We
Canadians.
announced our response to the IRA a year ago and still haven't implemented it.
Exactly.
Why would that be?
Well, we can talk about confederation, talk about minority governments. There's all sorts of reasons why that is. Those reasons don't matter to the market. because investors are not going to sit and wait for all these things to be worked out. They're already moving to the US, again, at speed. And that would be a great sort of commitment by all Canadian governments to move a lot faster than we have on all these decisions. Not that they're easy decisions, but the US has picked up the pace significantly, and the rest of the world needs to as well.
Right. So you are a man of the world. You go to these COP conferences. I don't want to get you in trouble, but you also go to Davos. You are the privy to all the things people say in the rooms that we're not allowed into. So here's my big question for you.
David, I also go to Lethbridge and Regina and Winnipeg, which I love a whole lot more than those fancy pants forums.
No, I know you're not a fancy pants guy. I wasn't trying to say you're over there for the canapes. But assuming there's a large probability based into your report that not all of this happens in time, right? It could happen, and I'd like to get to that in a second, which is the report says that all the technologies that we need are there. We're just not employing them to get there. But assuming that this doesn't happen, what will we be prepared to consider 10 or 15 years from now that we are not prepared to consider today?
It's a great question, David. I think we will need to, in the next year or two, sort of come to grips with, first of all, the 2030 challenge, which in terms of emission cuts by 2030 is going to be extremely hard. And I think everyone recognizes that. And it's interesting to see, even in the revisions of federal policies like the clean electricity regulations and the oil and gas emissions cap, more flexibility being built in, I think, in recognition that everyone is probably going to need a bit more time. And more important than time is getting on the right course. So whether we hit things by 2030 or 2032 is not worth probably tearing the country apart over. What's most important is to build the momentum towards these goals for the early 2030s. But we also need to recognize that there is a price to be paid for every year that we miss. To use the cliche, the planet's not waiting for us to get our act together. We see that in spades with every storm.
You can't negotiate with nature.
Every extreme weather event is telling us that there is a consequence for inaction, and those consequences, the price of those consequences, continues to go up. So what is the cost, to your question, 10, 15 years out? Well, we'll probably have to invest more, and we'll have to start doing this more in what's called resilience and adaptation, building our communities, building our roads, building our ports in ways that accept the reality that we will have more extreme weather events. In fact, the word extreme is going to probably fade away, because that becomes the norm, not the extreme. So that has a cost. It can be flood-proofing your house. That costs money. Fireproofing your town. That costs money.
Insurance is going to disappear, isn't it, John?
No, but it's
property insurance.
Costlier. It's not going to disappear, but it's going to get costlier. And to look at it more positively, I think there will be benefits for consumers, for homeowners, to flood and fireproof their homes. So insurance will still be available, but I suspect you'll continue to pay more for not taking protective action, or conversely, you'll get a benefit for taking protective action. And that's a good thing. That's the market. Maybe that's the upside of this. That's the market at work. But there's also collective cost to this, and in protecting our transportation systems and our supply chains, our bridges from these increasingly frequent, as I said, extreme, not so extreme weather events. So that's going to be a claim on our budgets, a claim on our capital that will mean that less is available for mitigation and investments in a lower emissions economy. So we really need to think about that trade-off. It's we don't have enough money to spend endlessly on both. So we'll have to make that adjustment.
Right. So at the end of the day, I know you're an optimist. That's just your nature. So weave for me the story of success here.
The story of success is already happening across the country. We're seeing more people take climate action, whether it's buying electric vehicles or heat pumps, or municipalities investing in lower emissions transit systems, which is happening across the country. But one of the stories I love to see, David, is what farmers are doing across the country in terms of sustainable agriculture, whatever you want to call it, climate smart agriculture, changing their farming systems, changing their livestock management systems, changing their soil management systems in ways that are not just reducing emissions, but actually capturing emissions. Our report gives a scorecard for 6 major sectors, and there's only one that gets an excellent rating, and that's agriculture, because Canadian farmers, as well as the food supply chain, is doing things that the rest of the world is taking notice of. When I talk in the United States about what Canadian farmers are doing, and this is a big part of the Inflation Reduction Act as well, is helping farmers in Iowa and the Dakotas. So back to the point about what a Republican Washington would do. Well, it's not going to take that funding away from farmers in Iowa and the Dakotas, that's for sure. They're taking notice of what farmers in Saskatchewan and Manitoba are doing, and vice versa. They're learning from each other. Right. But that's a nice illustration to me of Canadians, not in some grand national plan, but just Canadians doing what makes sense to them, what gives them a competitive advantage, and ultimately what saves them money. Because so
what are they doing? What is always looking to save money? So what is driving them to make these decisions? It is self-interest. Right. Yes. And what is the self-interest in them?
Well, ask any farmer, number one, managing their costs, whether it's fertilizer or other or electricity, managing down those costs. They are all small business operators who lie awake at night, literally thinking about the cost side of the ledger. This larger energy and climate transition needs to increasingly be about reducing costs. Why do you think Biden called it the Inflation Reduction Act? It actually wasn't a political gimmick. It was about bringing down the cost of driving your kids to school or running your farm or running your factory. So it's about cost reduction. Inflation reduction sounds better, I guess. But how do we ensure that whatever we're doing in climate policy is about bringing costs down for all people across the economy? But we're seeing this with farmers. They're doing this because sustainable climate smart agriculture means smarter use of fertilizers, smarter use of water, smarter use of energy, all at a lower cost. But they also are committed to a better planet, because most farmers are thinking about what their kids are going to do with the land, and they want to ensure that their soil isn't degraded, that it's actually enriched with organic carbon. And that will ensure that the land is healthy for their kids and grandkids. And that, to me, is a great way of looking at climate policy. This isn't about some grand economic scheme. It's about managing the cost of living and ensuring that whatever we do, whether it's our house or our farm or our communities, is sustainable and maybe even better for our kids and grandkids.
So farmers, are they making that switch as a consequence of the imposition of the carbon tax? Or do they just see, would they be making it anyway, and they just see opportunities to reduce, costs for farmers? They face a bunch of oligopolies who, right? You're right. Costs are always the number one concern. In terms of switching to this precision agriculture and saving money on on energy. What role did the carbon tax play in putting them in that position?
Canadian farmers started doing this decades ago, 40 years ago, well before carbon pricing. What carbon pricing does is accelerate some action. Now, this is more contentious, understandably, for farmers because they don't have a lot of substitution options. Your tractor drives on diesel. There's not a lot of electric tractors out there, and even if there were, the charging infrastructure in the middle of Saskatchewan ain't there and ain't going to be there for a good while. So we have to be acutely aware of the differences between sectors and between geographies, as I mentioned earlier. But farmers were doing this a generation ago out of self-interest, better cost management, and also that view of sustainability. That said, we need to accelerate and scale this, and that's going to continue to require different approaches. So for farmers, we're looking at new models for carbon through carbon markets for carbon credits for farmers, so that a food company, and this is happening lots in the US and Europe, can reward the farmer, pay the farmer for better soil management, and use that as an offset against their own emissions. So there are market mechanisms that doesn't require any government money. There are market mechanisms that allow that supply chain, the producers and the retailers, to reward the initial producer, the farmer, for what they do. So we're excited about the market opportunity, about the investment opportunity, the capital opportunities that Canada can excel with.
Right. Do you have a policy suggestion for government?
We've laid out a few in the report of ideas that we think can be taken on this year. This isn't about 2030. There's big opportunity. Methane. Thank you. I was waiting, David, for us to get to methane. What a great opportunity for Canada, because we already are a world leader in methane capture. But there's a lot of methane that still goes uncaptured. We have the technology. We costed out at about $15 billion out to 2035. So it's a 10-year commitment, about $1 billion a year, largely through conventional oil and gas producers to cap methane, to keep it from flowing out of the pipes and into the atmosphere. We know how to do this. So this is something we can get going with this year. It's going to be increasingly important as we export more oil and gas with global demand going the way it's going. But we can also export this technology. It's back to that point about the economic opportunity here. We should be kind of the world leader of methane capture technology. That doesn't sound like a bumper sticker, but it's a great opportunity.
Doesn't methane come from cow farts? How do you capture that?
That's a whole different episode, David. But we're actually really good at that too as Canadians, and we're working with a whole host of farmers and food producers on methane capture technology for livestock operators. But the other opportunity is in oil and gas, where fugitive methane, it's just part of the process, goes out into the atmosphere. It's highly destructive, but we actually know how to capture and put it to better use.
Right. Great. John, thanks for your time today. And I really want to give you and RBC kudos for doing this report. And I hope you intend to keep it up. I found it highly readable. I found it very, very informative. I found it really balanced. I really felt like I was better informed after, it may not appear so on this show, but I really felt like I was better informed after reading it. So congratulations and thanks very much for that.
No, thanks, David. That's very kind of you. If people are looking for the report, as you mentioned, it's called Double or Trouble, but just go to rbc.com or search for the RBC Climate Action Institute. And glad you enjoyed the report, but hope people see this as a really interesting topic. This isn't a burden for the country. We see this as a big opportunity for the country.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, John Stackhouse, thought leader, and my longtime friend, lucky me. All right, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, all of you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened, and of course, great John Stackhouse for being here. Thanks very much, and we will see you next week with more of the Herle Burly. In the meantime, take care.
Herle Burly.